The received mind of Christ. An introduction. The counterfeit we inherit and the mind we receive. These have indeed an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body, but they are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. Colossians chapter 2, verse 23. Bring to mind for a moment the Jesus you actually carry, not the one you would defend in a doctrinal statement, but the one who appears unbidden. When you pray, when you are afraid, when you're deciding what to do. Notice his face. Notice his temperament. What he warms to, what he cannot abide, whom he is patient with, and whom he is not. That figure is doing an enormous amount of work in your life. It is the lens through which you read every page of Scripture and every event of your week. And the question this book begins with is a disquieting one. How much of him is real, and how much have you made up? The reflex is to answer, he is the Jesus of the Bible, and to move along. But the reflex is too fast because it assumes the very thing in question, that the figure in your head and the figure in the text are the same figure. They may be. Often they are not, and you would be the last to know. For the lens through which you read the text is the same lens the question is asking you to inspect, and a lens cannot easily turn and examine itself. Here, though, is the part most diagnoses miss, and it is the burden of this book's subtitle. You did not assemble your counterfeit from nothing. You inherited it. It was handed to you by a parent, a pulpit, a tradition, a paperback, a worship chorus, already shaped, already tilted. And you received it the way a child receives a mother tongue, invisibly, before you could evaluate it, as simply the way things are. Then, over years, you bolted your own preferences onto the inherited frame. A verse that flattered you here, an emphasis that suited your temperament there, and called the finished product, my faith. The fabrication is real, but it is mostly inheritance plus accretion, not invention. And the cruelest feature of the whole process is that no one in the chain knew they were doing it. Your teachers passed on a partly counterfeit Christ in good conscience, because they had received him that way from teachers who had done the same. This is not a modern skeptic's worry smuggled into the text. It is, remarkably, the Apostle Paul's own anxiety, and he registered it in the first generation. Writing to Colossae, within roughly 3 decades of the resurrection and under apostolic authority, Paul warns, "See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ." The exact identity of the philosophy at Colossae is debated, and we will not pretend otherwise. But the structural alarm is unmistakable, and it is the alarm this book amplifies. Already, in the apostolic age, a more impressive and more culturally respectable system was beginning to overwrite Christ alone, a self-made religion with an appearance of wisdom. If the genuine article was being bent that early, under Paul's own eyes, the odds that the bending stopped in the 18th centuries since are not good. This book proceeds on the assumption that it did not stop, and that recovering the unbent Christ is the central task of Christian formation, not a footnote to it. The New Testament has a word for the faculty in question, nous, the mind, but not in the thin modern sense of raw intellect. The nous is the seat of perception and judgment, the organ by which a person construes God, self, and world. It is closer to what we mean by worldview than to what we mean by intelligence. Paul's most famous sentences about it are precisely about its formation and deformation. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. And, astonishingly, we have the mind of Christ. The whole of this book lives in the distance between those 2 verses, between the mind that is conformed to this world by default and the mind of Christ that must somehow be received. The historic name for the default condition is the noetic effects of sin, the conviction that the fall damaged not only the will, but the knowing faculty itself, so that the mind does not merely lack information, but actively distorts what it takes in. We may call the resulting condition, less technically, the made-up mind, a mind that fabricates a self-flattering construal of reality and then experiences that construal as simple perception. The decisive feature of the made-up mind, the feature that makes it a genuine predicament and not just a bad habit, is that it is undetectable from the inside. The instrument that would audit your picture of Jesus is the very instrument that drew the picture. There is no neutral, uncompromised vantage within you from which to run the check. Introspection only ever returns you to the same biased construal, now wearing the costume of what I sincerely believe. Sincerity is no defense, because sincerity is exactly what a well-made counterfeit produces. This is why the predicament cannot be solved by trying harder, looking deeper, or being more honest with oneself. Those are all operations of the compromised faculty by the compromised faculty. If the disease is a self-invisible deformation of the very faculty that would diagnose it, then the cure has a forced shape. It cannot be generated from within. It must be received from outside. That sentence is the thesis of this book. The human person does not by default possess the mind it imagines it has. It fabricates a counterfeit mind and cannot detect the forgery from within. The remedy is therefore received from outside. The mind of Christ, imparted by the living Spirit, the mind of God, given in measure, and mediated through three corruptible externals. The Word read in its native frame, the Spirit, and the body of Christ. It is entered not by acquiring information, but by a covenant switch of allegiance. Loyalty to the enthroned King, not bare assent. And it is reconstructed by walking the pre-canonical formation field that the canon records. The long road from Adam to Jesus along which the genuine mind was actually shaped before there was a New Testament to record it. I call this program, as a shorthand, noetic formation, the deliberate, gradual shaping of the mind, the cognitive cousin of what the tradition calls spiritual formation. The book's argument is that there are finally only two kinds of noetic formation on offer. The fabricated kind, which we inherit and augment unawares, and the received kind, which comes to us from outside ourselves and reforms us against our own grain. The first feels like freedom and is bondage. The second feels like surrender and is the only freedom there is. It is worth pausing on the word outside, because it is the structural hinge of everything that follows. If your difficulty were ignorance, the cure would be information, and information can be self-administered. Read more, study harder. But the difficulty is not ignorance. It is distortion, a bias in the lens, not a gap in the data. You cannot correct a warped lens by looking through it more intently. You need a straight edge from outside the system, something not generated by your own mind, against which your mind can be measured and, where necessary, broken and reset. That is what the three externals are for. None of them is infallible. Each can itself be bent, which is why they are held together and not singly. But each has the one property introspection lacks. It comes from outside the compromised faculty, and so it can say something your mind would never have told you on its own. The word nous has a second home in the history of religion, and it is not a friendly one. In the great second-century systems we loosely call Gnostic, nous is not a human faculty at all, but a divine being, an emanation within the fullness of the divine realm, in some schemes the very mind of the unknowable Father. And the salvation those systems offered was gnosis, a secret, saving knowledge of one's true origin, of the spark of divinity trapped within, of the password by which the soul might ascend past the lower powers and escape the material world. A reader who knows that history may reasonably wonder whether recovering the mind of Christ is not simply gnosis in Hebrew dress. It is the reverse, and showing why it is the reverse is one of this book's sustained tasks. We will name a cluster of motifs found in identifiable texts, and show that on each motif, the program of this book inverts the move. Gnosis saves by knowledge. Noetic formation is entered by allegiance and matured by becoming, not by knowing. Gnosis awakens a divine spark already within. Noetic formation insists the cure is received from outside, because there is no uncompromised spark within to awaken. Gnosis is esoteric for a spiritual elite. The received mind is a public gift. Its marks checkable by anyone, given preferentially to the lowly. Gnosis is anti-body and anti-cosmos, a flight of the soul out of evil matter. The received mind ends not in escape, but in bodily resurrection and a renewed creation. Gnosis posits a lower, botched maker beneath the true God. This book confesses one good creator, whose hostile rivals are creatures in rebellion, not a rival maker. Gnosis makes nous a divine emanation. We use nous in its plain Pauline sense. The human faculty, renewed, conformed to the mind of Christ. The pattern is exact enough to state as a slogan. Gnosis looks within and ascends. The gospel receives from above and is raised. Same word, opposite religion. Here we reach the claim the subtitle places on the cover, and we must make it carefully because it is easy to make badly. The genuine Jesus is a Hebrew figure, a first-century Galilean Jew whose mind was formed in the cognitive world of the Hebrew Scriptures and the wider ancient Near East. Its categories of covenant and kingship, temple and image, exile and return, the divine counsel, and the disinheritance of nations. He read reality in that frame, embodied it, and bequeathed it to apostles who reasoned in the same idiom. To understand his mind, one must inhabit his world, not import him into ours. What happened over the following centuries, unevenly, with gains as well as losses, is that the Church increasingly read this Hebrew Messiah through the lens of Greek philosophical culture, until a great many of his native categories were quietly refracted into something more abstract, more dualistic, and more amenable to the prestige systems of late antiquity. I name this refraction with the construct prism, the bending of the Christian mind as it passed through a Hellenizing medium, so that the same light emerged at a different angle. Two disciplines are required here. First, this is not the crude thesis that Greek equals poison and Hebrew equals pure. Greek thought also served the Church well at points, and Hebrew is no magic word. What prism names is refraction, a measurable change of angle, and the work of the book is to distinguish, case by case, legitimate development from genuine corruption, not to indict an entire intellectual heritage. Second, the recovery proposed here is itself the opposite of a Gnostic move. We are not claiming a secret, esoteric retrieval available only to initiates. The recovery is textual, historical, public, and falsifiable. It works from the preserved canon and the recoverable cognitive world of the biblical authors, by ordinary scholarly means, open to checking and to correction. To recover the Hebrew Christ is to de-Hellenize, to demystify, the very reverse of importing a Greek mystery religion. The recovery is anti-Gnostic on its own terms. A book that accuses the whole tradition of an undetectable drift had better be candid about how it proposes to know better, lest it simply substitute one confident mind for another. Every substantive claim in this book has passed through a deliberately adversarial procedure before being asserted. Gather the primary data, the Hebrew and Greek text, the ancient Near Eastern and Second Temple environment, and the way the apostles themselves used the Scriptures. Debate it under its strongest objection before defending it. Adjudicate what survives only with declared pressures, and what must be set aside as overreach. And only then write, at the confidence the evidence warrants. Two controls govern throughout. The apostolic use of the Old Testament functions as the interpretive control, and the data are read ancient Near Eastern broad, but through the Hebrew lens. This book is written for readers willing to work a little. Technical terms are glossed at first use and then used freely, and a glossary stands at the back. A word about the recurring named constructs. Prism, the early Binitarian framework by which the Spirit is the living mind of God. Allegiance, functional ontology, the divine counsel allotment, and others. These are the author's organizing models, drawn from a larger body of work. They are not offered as house jargon, but as compressions of arguments made at length elsewhere. They earn their keep by letting a complex synthesis be carried in a word. The book moves in 3 movements. Movement 1, the road, sets out the predicament, the made-up mind, the plausible counterfeit, the door of allegiance, and then walks the pre-canonical formation field from Adam to Jesus, recovering the Hebrew categories in which the genuine mind was shaped. Movement 2, the workshop, turns from diagnosis to formation. How the received mind is actually made in a person through the 3 externals held together by their mutual correction, backstopped by providence. Movement 3, the embassy, follows the formed mind out into the world it is sent to serve through suffering toward a consummation that is emphatically of the body and the renewed creation. The made-up mind undone at last, not by superior knowledge, but by sight, face to face. A final word before we begin. The thesis of this book is not flattering, and it is not meant to be. It says that the mind you trust most is the one you should suspect first, and that the Christ you are surest of may be the one you have most carefully made up. That is a hard place to start, but it is the only honest one. And, as it happens, it is exactly where the gospel has always started. Not with the self you discover, but with the Lord you receive.